All right. Welcome back, everybody. We are here for another terrific SSP podcast. Today, we are going to dive into in season training, some of the nuts and bolts behind our in season training, how we implement it to our athletes, some of the expectations we have for them as far as training frequency, and how we kind of go in and develop their in season programming. Right. So, the last pod we did was about preseason. We are 2 weeks away from spring baseball starting here in Omaha, Nebraska. And so we really want to just lay out our kind of templates and just give everybody some information, I guess, on the differences between our preseason block that we're coming out of and what the in-season block's going to look like, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay. So I guess a good kind of jumping off point for us is how do we as strength and conditioning coaches or performance coaches, what do we do or what do we have to kind of change up with our programming? And I guess the biggest thing that we have to change as far as when we're sitting down to write a program is we understand that the stress levels on athletes when they're not in here are going to be completely different than maybe they are in the middle of December or January, right? I know that one thing we tell a lot of the parents when they're coming in is a stress is a stress on our athletes, right? So even when we might be in the middle of an off season, if an athlete is staying up late cramming for tests, if an athlete is having something in their personal life that's stressful, if an athlete is on a 3 or 4 day trip where maybe they were with their family but they didn't sleep much because they were traveling all over the place, like all of those are different stresses in an athlete's life, right? And so like in an off season, we are taking that into account and maybe manipulating the card for the athlete at that given time, right? So a stress is a stress, right, in that scenario. Now the stressors on the athletes are a little bit more predictable, I guess. We understand that practices are going to be stressful for them, and maybe not from like a mental side, but maybe a physical side, and then also flip-flopped, right? Sometimes they might be more mentally stressful and less physically stressful. We know that games are obviously stressful situations. We're still dealing with school for them, and then obviously they still have personal lives. So those are all these things that we are trying to navigate and understand that, again, at the end of the day, the body perceives any sort of external stress as stress. It doesn't really differentiate between staying up late cramming for a test versus playing a 9 inning extra inning game and having to dealing with that stress. So that's kind of where we're at, right? Or that's the biggest thing, at least in my brain, when we're trying to kind of switch gears here, is making sure we're taking that into account, right?
Definitely. Definitely. And like you were saying, like the body perceives stress, all stress like the same way. I got echoes on. But the body perceives stress the same, right? Whether it's like you said, the schoolwork or family or social life or whatever it is, right? It'll view all stress as the same, right? But it's still different in a way, right? So even though the body is like could be stressed, from a neuro neuro standpoint, right? It doesn't necessarily say that you're going to be stressed from a muscular standpoint too, right? And so that's why it's important too, like to continue training in season with all these different stressors that are kind of going on, because your body will be stressed overall, but it's more on like the brain and nervous system side rather than on the muscular side because we
Right, and
switched
that's
so much from the heavy training that we did.
well, yeah. I guess my main point, right? Because you kind of touched on it maybe a little better than I did, is like the central nervous system, right? Maybe instead of saying the body, we should say the central nervous system doesn't doesn't really have the ability to differentiate between stressors, right? So navigating the central nervous system and making sure that is able to fire and function at its highest level when we're wanting it to, aka games and practices. That is really, really kind of what everything comes down to. So that's you kind of. I just wanted to
Exactly.
clarify my point a little bit and maybe give a little more clarification on, instead of saying body, say central nervous system.
Exactly. And, like you said, CNS stress, your body can't differentiate between good and bad stress, right? It's just stress overall, right? Whether you're laughing or crying, right? You are able to know what the changes are in your head. Like, oh, I cried, that's a bad stress, right? I'm laughing, that's a good stress, right? But your body still views the stress as the same. But as we get into in season, right, people have different stresses because of games and practices and their sport specific stuff going up. And it's still really, really important to get in the weight room and continue to develop a neuromuscular, the neuromuscular side of it and have that stress with it because your nervous system plays a big part in how your muscular system works. And same thing with your muscular system, plays into how your nervous system works, right? That's why there's the neuromuscular pathways and stuff that we train when we're in the weight room. And, a lot of people don't fully understand why it's important to train in season, but there have been numerous studies that are out there that talk about how detraining happens over, you know, as little as 5 days if you don't train a specific quality, and sometimes in as little as a month, right? And
Mm-hmm.
in the spring season, if you don't train over those 3 months, you will then lose some of the capabilities that you have trained so hard during the off season for, right?
Right.
Because when we're in here, we train, speed, power, speed, strength, speed, maximal strength. We train five. We talked about that curve a little bit ago on a
Surf the
different
curve,
podcast,
baby.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And we want to train all along that curve, right? And if we just stop, you will lose a significant amount of progress that you've made and regress during that 3 month period that they do have games.
Yeah. I think I remember vividly as a player the difference in how I felt. We'll say high school and college, actually vivid memories of how I felt beginning of the year versus end of the year. Where beginning of the year you feel, now this is before we had like ability to track, so again all feel, but the way or the ball came off my bat beginning of the season, right, versus end of the season, and it was different. The ball was not coming off my bat the same at the end of the year as it was at the beginning, and I really put a lot of the blame on lack of my commitment to any sort of in-season training. Okay, and this is again early to mid 2000s when it's not quite as well known. We don't know how to navigate it quite as we didn't know how to navigate it quite as well then as we do now. We'll get into how we navigate that um, here in a couple of seconds. But it was totally acceptable to just shut it down in the weight room while your season was going on, and that really is not the case anymore. We have too much knowledge. We have too many kind of anecdotals also of guys getting even stronger during their season, but not taxing themselves so much that they can't go out and perform. So there's all this kind of evidence and all these kind of things that are really shining a light on in-season training and how that's or in the
For
past has
sure.
been such a missed opportunity for athletes, right? And
100%.
I think,
And on
you know,
top of that, oh, continue.
well, if you're going to jump off of that, go, because my thing will kind of move us into
Well,
another
I was just
direction.
going to say, well, I think I almost forgot my train of thought. You go first. I might catch it back.
Okay, so I think the biggest kind of objection that I've heard in the past is kind of going back to what we started talking about was, hey man, I'm already kind of feeling like I'm getting pulled in a lot of different directions here with practice, with games. Maybe there's like a hitting lesson mixed in during the week, obviously school, because we're talking about spring season, and they already feel like they're taxing themselves. And so they don't want to come in because in athletes' brains, they kind of think like, man, we know what it was like training with you guys in December and January. And that is training year round is like that, right? So it's always kind of a knockdown, drag out training session where we're putting the guys down and we're kind of kicking their butt and they're, feeling sore for the next couple of days and things like that. And I think that is one of the biggest misconceptions about in-season training, right? That like, again, training in April and May looks like training did in December, January, and that's just not the case, right?
Definitely. And
Or at least here.
I do
Maybe I should,
remember, yeah, for sure, for sure.
you know,
Um, and I do remember my train of thought. So, you hit it pretty well on the nose, talking about how you felt at the beginning of the year versus at the end of the year, right? Especially end of like college season, right? College season is a little bit different than high school season. Usually you try to get 50, 55 games in a 2.5, 3 month period. And then you have playoffs, whether that's conference tournament, regional, super regional. And then if you make it to the Mecca, you get to the College World Series, right? But some of these teams play like 70 to 75 games in a year almost, which is a lot of freaking games, right? And it really doesn't matter at the end of the day how you feel at the beginning of the year, right? You obviously want to be feeling good and firing all cylinders at the beginning of the year, but that's not when it matters, right? If you're the eighth seed in a conference tournament and you made the conference tournament, you're still in the conference tournament. You could win the conference tournament and make a regional and so on and so forth, right? But all of that's dependent on how you're performing at the end of the year and how you're feeling at the end of the year, right? And there's a lot of correlation between training throughout in season and how athletes feel at the end of the season, towards the end of the season, right? They feel better. They're able to perform at a higher level. They have higher power outputs. They're higher speed outputs. They have higher, their strength at the very least is staying at the same level that it was at the beginning of the year, right? And I know one thing, and I might be jumping into the next topic that we have a little bit with this, but one thing we really strive for here is the least amount that gets a positive adaptation, right? And where we're
yep.
not putting someone into the floor like what you're talking about with kind of our, November, December, January training, or really trying to really get them down so then they can recover and super compensate, right? We're trying to get it so then instead of a big dip to the big come up, it's a small dip to a small come up, right? And it's
Right.
incremental over time, and we're in a positive overall throughout the year, if not staying at the same. The last thing we want is someone to dip down and then keep dipping down and then keep dipping down where they can't ever get back to even their baseline zero. And that is, a big attest to in-season training because you're able to restore mobility a lot of times because that's something that we focus quite a bit on during our in-season training. We focus a lot on mobility and range of motion, and which kind of goes with mobility. And then there's strength, speed, strength. And then we also work on their total speed and maximal strength capabilities, right? You don't need to train at 100% of your one rep max, right? You don't need to try to get to your one rep max. But if you're feeling good that day and you got a deadlift for 2 reps, and all of a sudden you're like, hey, my PR is 365 pounds, right? And you're like, dude, 345 moved like butter, right? Maybe you jump to 365 and you hit it for two. All of a sudden you just hit your previous PR for 2 reps versus one, right? And there's a
Yeah.
lot of stories of people doing that. I know a guy that I follow quite a bit is Zach Dakin, the TCU strength coach. And he has numerous stories of guys coming in on a Monday for an optional lift and they PR on like a front squat. And they just got off of a plane no less than 12 hours ago and they just had a 3-game weekend with a midweek before that and all that stuff. But because they do have that in-season training stuff, they're able to retain a high level of performance and continue to push the needle in the right direction from a strength
Right.
and speed standpoint.
Right. I think the so at very least, it is to keep the qualities that you've been working on throughout training in the off season, keep them at that baseline, right? But I think it is a little short sighted when people kind of just say this is oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the word. They're just going to try to stay the same. Like that's the goal is maintenance, right? That's what you always hear with in-season training. The goal is just to maintain. The goal is to just maintain maintenance, maintain maintenance. I think that's a little short-sighted because again, if you do this right, and we have examples of it, right, that we have seen and other people have talked about and published, I'm sure if we wanted to look hard enough, there is a way to move the needle in the correct direction again. So instead of just flatlining and staying the same, like you said, the incremental jumps are going to be much smaller, but you can still move the needle in the right direction. And I know we've been talking a lot about college and even high school athletes. I think it is really a missed opportunity in the youth training world. So some of like the 11, 12, 13-year-olds that we get, if all of a sudden they drop off for the 3 months of spring, right? Let's say they're doing 2 sessions a week. That is what, 8 sessions a month. So that's 8, 16, 24 sessions that they're just missing out on. And in terms of their long-term athletic development over multiple years and multiple cycles of their kind of season, whether it's off season to preseason, preseason to in season, they miss out on a big chunk of training. If you extrapolate that out over like a 3 or 4 year period, I mean, we're talking over 100 sessions that they've missed out on, right? And
And
so
if
when
you
you
even bring
zoom
it
out,
into less of the per session thing, right? If they miss out on 3 months of training, that's a quarter of the year, right? And if
yeah,
that's like you're saying over a 3 year or 4 year period, right? Say it's over a 4 year period, they missed out on an entire year of
entire
training,
year, right?
right? And that is a crazy amount. And especially at an age where they need to develop and continue, learning their bodies, right? Because I mean, people, you never know when a youth athlete is going to just shoot up and hit a big growth spurt, right?
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, they grow 6 inches and they haven't been doing anything. They look like they're a baby deer trying to move around everywhere, right? Whether that's in a
Right.
weight room, on a baseball field, in gym class, anything like that, their bodies have no idea what is going on or where they are in space.
Right. Yeah. So I think, with those younger athletes, the other point that I kind of want to drive home is oftentimes, again, we understand that athletes don't want to be sore and feeling banged up when it's game time, right? With the younger athletes, another point I want to make is that oftentimes they aren't capable, right, of moving enough load to really cause big time amounts of muscle soreness, big time negative effects as far as central nervous system is concerned. So oftentimes with the younger athletes, from our perspective, it turns into, hey, we're just grooving movement patterns, right? We are loading, but intelligently loading when they're in here, and they really shouldn't be worse for wear when they leave at all if we've done our job right. Okay, just because they have so many limiting factors in how much they can actually do while they're on the weight room floor. So with them, it is even, I mean, I don't want to say even more, but just as imperative that they take that in-season training and use that as time to continue their development, right?
Definitely.
And then obviously when we start working with the older guys, the high school and college athletes, that is where our job as coaches really comes in and is even more important, starting with how we program and what we're putting together for them, and then also moving towards monitoring them while they're in here, having conversations daily with how they're doing, what's next for them, what they have the previous day, what's the next couple of days look like as far as practices or games, and really getting in tune with them and their schedule, because then there's going to be opportunities for us to continue training, but continue training correctly or properly, or without doing some sort of a training that's going to affect them a couple of days from the training session. So I think this is a good opportunity. Let's kind of dive in. Do you have anything else that you wanted to pin on the end of that?
I think what I have in my brain is kind of like spiraling into the next thing that you're going to talk about.
Okay.
But it kind of goes based off of what you were just talking about with having the conversations with the athletes. One big thing that I love that we started to do more is pretty much readiness checks, right, in their daily prep. And we've, you know, one big thing that we use is jump metrics, right? And hey, if they're jumping out of the gym that day in comparison to what they have before, they're probably pretty primed and ready to go, right? But if they're way down, like in 2 inches, 3 inches down from what their normal vertex jump is, right? All of a sudden we know, hey, this kid's probably not feeling very good today. And then like usually sprint times go to show that same thing. And then like
Hmm.
deadlifts feel heavier or split squats feel heavier or just like overall
Right.
everything feels heavier, right? But that's one thing that we try to utilize towards our benefit is have an actual tangible way of measuring what the athlete's daily readiness is, because that tells us
Hmm.
how hard we can push them on that day, right? So
Right.
if they're, if they come in on a Tuesday and they just had a weekend of games, or a Monday and they just had a weekend of games, and they're like, oh, I feel like crap, right? We find out, we talk to them what they're feeling on a, psychological level and everything like that, and then we still run them through their daily prep, right? And in their daily prep is that jumping daily, readiness
Hmm.
check. And even though they might feel like crap, they might jump out of the gym that day. And then all of a sudden we're like, hey, dude, like your body is telling us that you're ready to go, right? Even though your mind's saying that you're not, your body's telling us that you're ready to go. And so
Right.
maybe we can push the envelope a little bit more. And then some days guys come in and they're like, I feel great, right? And all of a sudden they jump and they're like, my jumps are 4 inches down. And we're like, okay, your body's probably exhausted, even though you think that you're probably feeling better, right? You
Hmm.
probably are pretty beat up right now.
Yeah. Just easy way for us to get a feel besides just conversating with them, right? Besides just talking, because sometimes we get false reads from the guys, right? Like you said, I feel like crap today. They have their best day they've had in a while. I feel great today. Turns out to be a bad day, right? So that just gives us, objective measures to help kind of inform decisions as we're taking the guys from their warm ups into sprint training, power training, or their strength training that they're doing on the gym floor, right?
For
So,
sure.
like another thing, so that kind of frames maybe this next topic a little bit better. But let's dive into some of the things. So again, we're 2 weeks away from spring baseball season, spring sports season here in Nebraska. Let's talk about some of the things that we've been talking about when we've been sitting down and trying to put together in season training for the guys, right? Like, I know the first thing that pops off in my head is our expectation is we want guys to try their damnedest to get in 2 times a week, right? 2 times a week is like, all right, we're feeling good. 1 time a week, we're like, okay, it's better than nothing, right? We're still mitigating some of that pullback on some of their metrics and some of their testables and stuff like that. But 2 times a week is really where we want to see them be consistently, right? So the first thing is frequency. I mean, right now during the off season, we've had guys going 3, 4, 5 times a week, right? So the volume in total training sessions per week gets pulled down a little bit, right? Also, like just on a surface level, length of session is going to be much shorter, right? So some of our guys right now um, are in here an hour 15, maybe even like an hour 30. Yeah, for some of their training sessions. Maybe not so much now, but again, in kind of the heart of the off season. The goal for us once we get in season with these guys is to stay like 45 minutes or less, right? Some of those days you might even have the expectation of like 30 minutes. Get them in and get them out, right? So those are the two big kind of foundational differences, I would say, with how we structure in season training, right?
For sure. For sure. And then like you were talking about, we it's the least amount that we can do that gets a positive adaptation. And a lot of times in the off season, the months and stuff like that, we do spend more time in here. The athletes spend more time in here because there's more that we give them to do. And like you said, 2 times a week, we're able to actually work different planes of motion. We're able to work different hinge, squat, push, pull movements overall. and we're able to work different ranges of motions throughout, right? And then that helps mitigate the loss and detrain that can possibly happen within a specific, metric that we, usually use. And like you said, we don't want guys in here for an hour 15, hour and a half, or longer, right? We want them very, very max would be like an hour, right? And that's counting like a good quality warm up, a good prehab routine, a good, you know, power block sprint training, a good, 2 blocks of lifting, and then maybe if they want to do some mobility at the end, they can do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But really, we want the time for them to actually be training to be cut down. I think we were talking about this, what, to 2/3 of what they were
Yeah. So
before?
like the the easiest way to kind of think about it, right, is like, again, just super basic way of thinking is to cut everything in cut a third off of their training, right? So like if in the off season they were doing 4 sets of 5, right? Let's take a third of that out. So you can do that by manipulating reps. You can do that by manipulating sets. To make an even easier example, it's like if you were doing 3 sets of 10, now we're just doing 2 sets of 10 of an exercise, right? Um, so if you use that as kind of your rule of thumb or just a really basic way to guide you, it makes the decision making a little bit easier when like you and I are sitting there trying to hammer out the programming, right? Another thing
Yeah,
that's huge that we need to take into account is reduce or eliminate the introduction of new exercises into their programming, right? So like if it is some new exercise that we're really wanting to try, but we haven't done anything that looks even remotely close to that in the past 4 or 5 months, then introducing it in season is not the time to introduce that, right? The body isn't going to know really what's going on with that new exercise. That really increases your chance of creating a sore athlete after the workout, right? If it's a new movement pattern or a new drill or something like that. So mitigating or eliminating any sort of kind of like brand new thing for the athlete as far as the exercise selection goes is huge too. So like when our guys come in and they're on their in-season training program, theoretically, I mean, we could just hand it to them and they should be able to look at it and run the whole thing because it should be stuff that they're comfortable with, that we've already coached them on, that their body is already kind of understanding what to do, right? So that is another way
for
that we
sure.
mitigate that we kind of mitigate that soreness a day or two out after a training session.
For sure. And like you said, we really look at just everything from a total view, like from a out full standpoint, right? We don't want to just be like, hey, you have 3 sets of 6 reps, and that's what we've been running all year, and we're running at the same intensity all the time, and all that type of stuff, right? We're like, hey, we want you to stay at a high intensity still, but mitigate how much you actually have for, total volume, right? So like you're talking about, we're talking about total rep ranges. So three sets of 10 is 30 total reps, right? To take a third of it out, you'd be down to 20 reps. And then we're able to mitigate like, hey, how do we want to get to that? 20 reps, those 20 high quality reps that go good full range of motion, good movement quality, and still get towards the intensity range that we're looking for. And then another thing, like you said, with the exercise selection standpoint, right? If we were doing, a staple for our lifting is trap bar deadlift, right? It's a pretty foolproof way of deadlifting. We don't have to worry too much about like, um, you know, form uh, difficulties and people struggling to learn it, right? Sometimes teaching the hinge gets pretty interesting and that type of stuff, right? But we're not going to be like, oh, okay, all of a sudden we're just going to do a straight single leg deadlift with a trap bar or like some other crazy type movement, right? Because like you said, it introduces a different stimulus to the body that it's not used to, that it's never had before, right? And it's utilizing different musculature that we hadn't been using, and on top of that, it's using a different neuromuscular pathway that hasn't been trained yet either. So then that causes a whole different array because then that not only stresses the muscular system in a different way, but it also stresses the nervous system in a different way that could possibly put us into a different hole than what we're trying to put the athletes into during that time.
Right.
And
Right.
like, from the very first part of our talk, right? We talked about overall central nervous system load, right? And what we're trying to do is mitigate that as much as we can. And by keeping things familiar to the body and kind of routine like, we're
Hmm.
able to like lessen the stress on the like overall stress on the CNS that it could possibly happen, right? You know, even if we want to get a little bit more, right? We've been doing, if an athlete's been doing split squats for the last 5 months, right? And that's their main squat movement that we have. We're not going to be like, okay, now you got front rack front squats, right? You just got front
Right.
squats, right? Because we hadn't been training front squats for the last 5 months. Why would we introduce them now, right? It's going to
Hmm.
cause issues overall because we hadn't been front rack bilateral loading the athlete, right?
Right.
But to kind of get off that tangent a little bit, but we try to look at it from an overall viewpoint, right? And that's how we have to. Otherwise, then we create situations that we don't want to put our athletes in, and it could possibly impact their ability to perform in game at the very least. No, in practice at the very least, and at the very worst, in game, right? Because the last thing we
Right.
want to do is mess up how they're feeling in a game. If they're a
Right.
little sore for practice,
Yeah, not the end of
you
the
know,
world, right?
not the end of the world, right? But if they're like, dude, I front squatted yesterday for the first time in 6 months and I got a game today and I'm freaking feeling it overall, that is by far the last thing we want to do because that's going to impact their overall performance.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Which is
and
something
then,
that we have to deal with sometimes, not to cut you off, but we have to
no,
deal
you're
with
fine.
that sometimes because sometimes the water gets a little muddy when some of these athletes might be in like a weightlifting class at school or something like that. And whoever's implementing that class, you know what I mean? Like, hey, we're doing whatever block they have built out might not be built out for a in-season athlete. And so all of a sudden they're doing 4x10 a back squat in weightlifting class. You know what I mean? And
Yeah,
that sort of thing is perfectly fine for the weightlifting class, right? But
for sure.
with that guy who's a starting pitcher at the local high school, and then he's got to go throw later that day or the next day, but he did that squat workout because that's what his grade depends on or something like that. Like that is just kind of one of the things that can cause some issues in these kids' lives. You know what I mean? I'm not saying that they shouldn't be participating in their weightlifting class, but I understand some of the like trepidation or some of the maybe like nervousness on their end because they know what some of those situations that they maybe have been put into in the past have caused going forward and how they felt when they lace up their spikes and go step on the field. So it's like
Definitely.
that, you know what I mean? There is a correct way to do it, and I really think I really think the program that we have been putting together kind of hits all of those things and
Definitely.
allows the athletes to keep working on what we've been working on, but does it in a smart way, right?
Definitely. And then to kind of, go into a little bit more of what we program and why we program it, right? So, if we have an athlete come in twice a week, right, we're probably going to have them jump, sprint, hinge, squat, push, and pull, right? It's the six basic things that we've got overall, right? That's the foundation of our programs from head to toe, right? And the reason why we continue to do that, especially the sprinting part of it, even though they might have base running in practice or they might have, they may have hit two doubles the day before or whatever it is, right? The reason why we have something like that is because we still need to train maximal speed and do our best
Mm-hmm.
to get as close to maximal speed as possible. Because, we talked about this a little bit. When people are doing base running in practice, usually it's a 3-step burst out of their lead and they do that 10 times or whatever it is, right? And yeah, that probably works on their acceleration, right? But it doesn't get them to their top speed. And
Yeah.
it's not often guys are going to hit two doubles in a game overall, right? Like it's tough to hit two doubles every single game. And we do need to continually to train maximal speed because, like some of the different research articles that we've dove into or people that we, follow that they've talked about, right? If you don't train maximal speed, right, five, within a 5-day window, plus or minus 3 days, you will lose a statistically significant amount, right? You're not going to
Right.
lose, 2 miles an hour off your top speed, right? But if you consistently do that over a 3-month period, you will lose speed like probably a mile or 2 miles an hour over that 3-month period
Yeah, considerable, right?
because you're going over that 3-month period without actually training top speed. And then same thing with maximal strength, right? One of the days that we have, we're gonna have trap bar deadlift, and they're gonna do probably 3 sets of two at least 85% of their 1 rep max, right?
Yep.
And the reason why we do that is because if they don't train maximal strength 30 days plus or minus 5 days, either way, they will lose a statistically significant amount of maximal strength. And
Right.
we really try to take all that into account here because, if all they're doing is swinging a bat, or all they're doing is, rounding bases or fielding ground balls all the time, right? That doesn't train any of those qualities, right?
Hmm.
And yeah, maybe if you're
It doesn't
busting your
train any of the
balls from
physical qualities that we're looking at,
exactly,
right? It'll
exactly,
take care
and
of the baseball stuff. Yes, it's still touching on, obviously, and doing work there. But
for
like,
sure,
as far as what we're concerned with when we see them, yeah, it's a miss for them.
for sure. And we've talked about this in previous podcasts too, right? We're in the business of training the athlete's overall capacity to output force, strength, speed, any of those metrics, right? And our job is to try to at least maintain, if not improve, all of those metrics during this time. And the only way that you do it is by doing it,
Right.
right? You have to do that type of stuff in order to get better at it. And that's why it's so important to do it in season, because guys work their butts off over the last 3, 4, 5 months, if not the full last year, right?
Hmm.
But if they don't do it, they're going to lose it. There's so
Yeah.
many research articles out there that talk about how if you don't use it, you're going to lose
I was gonna say that. Is it true? If you don't use it,
it.
you lose it.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
Yeah, yeah, that's so huge. That's so huge. I mean, it's kind of looking at those charts. It's kind of fun to look at them because it helps us prioritize what our sessions look like. Right? It's like, okay, we know that maximal speed goes the quickest, right? So that moves up the list, the priority list for us. And again, it's not like we're going to be running 12, 15 sprints a day with the guys. It's like, hey, we need you to touch 95% of your max speed. So we have all the data from all the last 4 or 5 months for our guys, some guys going back years. We need you to touch, and we can actually assign them a number that we need them to hit as far as their speed goes, or a time, I should say, not a number. We can assign them a time and say, hey, this is your goal every day you come in here and sprint. And maybe it takes them like 2 or 3 sprints to do it. Hey, you're good. Move on to the next thing, right? Because we know that we have to touch that threshold in order to keep that quality trained on the athletes, right? So that's the cool thing about having all this data at our fingertips. As far as the guys have been doing a great job recording their stuff, we can implement that 95% rule with the sprint, and boom, they know what their number needs to be. They can hit it. They can get on to the next thing, right?
For sure.
So yeah, using that chart, using some of those other metrics really makes our job a little bit easier and helps give the guys some tangible things to shoot for, just like the 85% of your best 1 rep on the trap bar, right, or something like that. So um, giving them things to strive for, or like goals to hit each session, also allows us to keep them engaged and keep them kind of rolling in the right direction. I think we could talk even
Definitely.
longer, but stuff's getting a little hairy in here. So let's cut it right there. All right. Good talk. We will hopefully be back soon with another high school preview. But until next time, Alex, good talk. We'll see you out there. Okay. Peace.
Likewise. Yep.